Ahoy there, mates, and welcome to the VHS pirate ship. You're just in time. I just got my Invisible Man model kit in the mail. Oh, man. Looks great, doesn't it? There you go. What do you think, Paul the Skull?
What do I think? I don't bloody see him.
Well, yeah, he's invisible. Duh.
Greetings.
Hey, little creep.
What are you doing?
Well, my Invisible Man model kit just showed up.
Neat. It looks great. Very good likeness.
You know, there's something I've always wondered about the Invisible Man.
What's that?
Well, you know how it says, like, when he eats food, he has to wait for it to digest before he can do anything because you can see it?
Yes, it adds realism.
Yeah, but I mean, does that mean you could, see his poop, too?
You mean like you can see the turds forming inside his body?
Yeah.
You would just see poop floating around.
Yeah, there's poop floating around.
Is that all you take away from the story? His poop?
You're right. Let's be serious. You'd see him with poop floating around.
Yeah, just poop floating around. Out of the middle of nowhere, just floating around.
Hey, I know. Let's ask VC Arnold.
Yeah, maybe he can shed a little light on the subject.
Hey, VC Arnold.
I am VC Arnold, and I have overheard your tomfoolery, and my data suggest that even though the Invisible Man's digestive system would be invisible, the food he eats, and therefore the waste it creates, would not be invisible. So, yes, you would be able to see the Invisible Man's poop.
Bloody hell, this makes me want to die all over again.
So, hey, that reminds me. What's today's episode going to be? It's the Invisible episode. Let's check it out and find some answers.
A floating turd! Bloody hell, why am I even here?
All right, folks, let's check out all things invisible and get ready for today's adventure. Yo ho ho!
Time for the show!
Yar!
Yar! Yar! What if you had the power of invisibility? Ooh!
Yes, indeed, invisibility, which, of course, is the ability to be invisible.
Yeah, no
Which is a concept that's captured our imaginations for a long time. And when you're asked the hypothetical question, what superpower would you have, invisibility is usually on that list. And we've all mused on what it would be like to have the power of invisibility. But let's face it, we'd all probably use it just to walk around being little creeps.
Hey!
Oh, sorry, little creep. But you know, you really have to wonder if this was even a thought before H.G. Wells took this concept and turned it into a famous novel, which was published in 1897, and with the help of the Island of Dr. Moreau and the Time Machine, the Invisible Man would help put H.G. Wells on the map. And these three books of his actually established him as the father of science fiction. Oh, I'm sorry. I meant
Science fiction!
So this story became immensely popular. So popular, in fact, that Universal Pictures took notice. And The Invisible Man was released in theaters November 13th, 1933. And this is where this story becomes really, really popular. I mean, the book itself was very popular, but the Universal Pictures movie made this shoot through the roof. So much so, in fact, that the Invisible Man would become one of the Universal monsters. Right up there with Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, the Mummy, the Wolfman. I mean, you get the picture. The Invisible Man was now a monster. Though be it, I suppose he is sort of a B-list monster. I don't know, it's kind of like if you were to call the Monster Agency and wanted Dracula for a party, but he wasn't available, so they would just send the Invisible Man. You know what I mean? You know, it is kind of odd if you think about it, that why is the Invisible Man considered one of the famous movie monsters? I mean, why is he a monster? He's invisible. You're categorizing him with Dracula and the Mummy. I mean, the Invisible Man kind of stands out. I mean, not really because he's invisible, but you know what I mean. Yeah, it just sort of seems more like espionage thriller material as opposed to a monster movie, but you know, it is what it is, and The Invisible Man was extremely popular. So yeah, the movie was a hit, and man, they must have saved a fortune in the wardrobe department. You get it? Because he's invisible? You get it? No? Oh, man. But yeah, I know the story involves Dr. Jack Griffin, otherwise known as the Invisible Man, or rather, the Invisible Man! So I guess we're going to do that the whole episode then? Yeah, okay. But anyways, yeah, I know Dr. Jack Griffin eventually goes mad with power. Having the power of invisibility will do that to you, I guess. Commits a bunch of murders, and even muses about world domination. But I mean, really, all that stuff makes him more of a Batman villain than a movie monster, but whatever. So the movie was successful, and since it is a book-to-film translation, we all know how that usually goes. You know, when they end up adding a bunch of stuff and leaving a bunch of stuff out and completely changing the story entirely. But not this time, because this film has been described as a near-perfect translation of the book. Oh, good. And in 2008, this film was selected for the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress. Whoop-de shit! And so The Invisible Man was a very important story and a very impactful film, as he became one of the famous movie monsters. And it was only a matter of time before The Invisible Man came to VHS. It was first released on VHS in 1987 by MCA Home Video, and was part of the Gene Shalit Critics' Choice collection. And he did this with a number of VHS tapes, including The Wolfman, so that's pretty neat. And you can find The Invisible Man Gene Shalit edition VHS fairly easily today, but it'll cost you around 25 buckaroonies. I mean, if you put Gene Shalit on a VHS tape, that's going to mean some automatic mid-tier pricing. And The Invisible Man was released again on VHS in 1991 by MCA Universal Home Video as part of the Universal Monsters Classics Collection. And just like in the Frankenstein episode, you're going to hear about this collection a lot. And since they made like a gazillion copies of this VHS, this is very easy to find today for very cheap prices. And Universal Home Video also released another collection of Universal Monsters on VHS in 1999. Only this time it was on a much smaller scale, as this collection only contained 8 movies. And you can bet your invisible ass that The Invisible Man was part of this collection. And again, they made like a gazillion copies of this VHS, and again, it's very easy to find today and very cheap. So if you want The Invisible Man on VHS for your collection, but ain't got that Gene Shalit money, well, these copies are more your speed. And if you search the internet for Invisible Man VHS, the 1999 distribution is usually the first one you come across. So I'm sure we're all very familiar with The Invisible Man. But are we familiar with the other Invisible Man material out there? And how far does The Invisible Man span throughout the cinematic landscape? Well, today we're going to find answers to these questions and talk about all things invisible and Chevy Chase. Huh? That's right, because it's today's adventure,
The Invisible Episode! The Invisible Man
had quite the impact on pop culture and became one of the famous movie monsters. And much like his monster colleagues, The Invisible Man would enjoy multiple sequels and spin-offs, which all started with
The Invisible Man Returns,
which was released in theaters January 12th, 1940. And apparently people were so ready for an Invisible Man sequel because this did very well at the box office. It was made for a budget of just under $250,000 and took in $815,000 at the box office. So how can The Invisible Man return? If you're familiar with the first movie, then you know that Dr. Jack Griffin dies. And if you didn't know that, then I totally just ruined the movie for you. Sorry. Well, The Invisible Man Returns focuses on Sir Geoffrey Radcliffe, a guy who's been wrongfully accused of murder, and he's helped out by a sympathetic Dr. Frank Griffin, the brother of Dr. Jack Griffin. Oh, his brother. That's what it is? Okay. You sure? Are you sure you're just not making stuff up to squeeze out a sequel to capitalize on the popularity of the first movie? No? You sure? Okay, so yeah, Dr. Frank Griffin injects Radcliffe with the invisibility serum to help him escape prison, which is a pretty well-laid plan, except there's one little problem. One of the ingredients in the invisibility serum is called monocaine, which makes it work just fine, except, well, one of the side effects of monocaine is it makes you go insane. Insane because of monocaine. So in the first movie, Dr. Jack Griffin didn't just go mad with power, he went plain insane. And the same thing was going to happen to Radcliffe, except it never does. And everything turns out okay. And, well, this movie is a lot milder than the first Invisible Man movie is. And Radcliffe is nowhere near as maniacal as Dr. Jack Griffin was. So how is this considered a monster movie? I mean, the whole movie is about a guy who's trying to clear his good name from a murder he was framed for. Yeah, it's more like a crime drama that just happens to involve invisibility serum, conveniently enough, and involves the brother of the first Invisible Man who comes out of nowhere to further the plot along. Even more conveniently enough. I don't know, it just seems more like an episode of Columbo than it does a monster movie, let alone an Invisible Man sequel. But, oh well. They were trying, and I don't really know what else they really could have done, so it is what it is. And Radcliffe is played by Vincent Price, and this is one of the movies that would establish him as a horror movie icon. Though I'm not entirely sure you could really consider this a horror movie, but it is, so there you go. And Universal Pictures obviously thought The Invisible Man Returns was a horror movie, because in 1992, it was released as part of the second wave of the Universal Monsters Classics Collection. Yeah, get ready, because like I said, I'm going to be talking about this collection a lot in this episode. And what's interesting is that this collection would be the first and only time many of the movies featured in it would be released on VHS, including The Invisible Man Returns. So that must mean it's rare and worth a lot of money, right? No way, Jose. Yeah, that's a big no on that one. They mass-produced all of these, so they're really easy to find today and very cheap. So it would seem that in 1940, Invisimania was running wild, because not only did we get The Invisible Man Returns, but also we got The Invisible Woman, which was released in theaters December 27th, 1940. And it's different. All right. This movie sucks. I'm just not entirely sure what they were trying to go for with this movie. It's not a horror movie. It's certainly not a monster movie. It's not a crime drama. It's more like a screwball, wacky comedy. I really have no idea. There's no more invisibility serum involved. Instead, there's an invisibility machine. Okay. The movie centers around Kitty Carroll, a department store model who had just been fired from her job and takes part in this invisibility experiment. And of course, the experiment is successful, and Kitty uses her newfound invisibility to terrorize her former boss. And that's about it. That's really all that happens. I mean, there's gangsters involved that try to steal the invisibility machine, but that doesn't really go very far, so there you go. I mean, what is this, a fucking article from Teen Vogue, for fuck's sakes? Okay, to be fair, they weren't really trying to make a horror movie with this one. It's more like a sci-fi comedy. They certainly used the invisible thing to really sell this movie and make it seem like it was a part of the other Invisible Man films. And if you went to go see this movie expecting another Invisible Man movie, or at least a horror movie, you were going to be very disappointed. Okay, so one cool thing about this movie is that Margaret Hamilton is in it. And it was pretty neat to see her in something other than The Wizard of Oz or that one episode of Mr. Rogers. And you know who else is in this movie? Shemp Howard. That's right, the most underrated stooge, Shemp, is in this movie. And I certainly was not expecting that. Okay, so maybe I was being a little too harsh when I said this movie sucked earlier. Because I mean, well, it is what it is. And that's a wacky sci-fi comedy. And it was never advertised to be a horror movie. That's something everyone just eventually assumed. Oh, so it's our fault now. And even the back of the VHS case describes it as one of the wackiest stories you've ever seen. And speaking of VHS, this was released in 1993 as part of the third wave of the, you guessed it, Universal Monsters Classics Collection. And this would be the first and only time this was released on VHS. And you know, releasing this on home video along with a bunch of other monster movies certainly didn't help sway people away from thinking this was a horror movie. And though most of the movies featured in the Universal Monsters Classics Collection are rather easy to find, some of them aren't so easy to find, and The Invisible Woman is one of those. Now, you may have some luck finding one for around $10, but usually you find these kind of jokers. 90 bucks? Come on, dude. And in 1983, there was a TV movie about the Invisible Woman called, it was called The Invisible Woman. But I won't be talking about this because it was never released on VHS, and plus it's fucking stupid. So far, we've seen The Invisible Man, which I know doesn't sound possible. And we've seen The Invisible Man return. And we've seen the power of invisibility placed upon a woman. A woman! But what would happen if you used the power of invisibility in warfare? And we would find out with
The Invisible Agent,
which was released in theaters July 31st, 1942. And this would be the most successful Invisible Man spinoff. Yeah, people just weren't giving up on the Invisible Man franchise. And this one is a little different than the other Invisible Man films, as it actually utilizes a practical use of the invisibility serum. And yes, the invisibility serum is back for this movie, so forget about the invisibility machine, let's just ignore it. And unlike The Invisible Woman, this movie ties in directly with the first two Invisible Man films, as it centers around Frank Griffin Jr., the grandson of Dr. Jack Griffin. Okay, are you sure you guys aren't just making stuff up to make more sequels? I only ask because there is absolutely no information given about any offspring Dr. Jack Griffin may have had from the first two movies. So therefore, by default, it does seem like you're just making this up. Well, they are. And we can forgive it because it is a movie and they are trying to do something different. And it is very different, and it's a very interesting concept. It takes place during WW2, and Frank Griffin Jr., who goes by the alias Frank Raymond, uses the invisibility serum to help the U.S. and the Allied forces in the war effort, as only an invisible man can. And this is certainly not a horror movie. It's definitely more of an espionage, sabotage type movie. Yeah, this feels like a Tom Clancy novel, if Tom Clancy had been born earlier and delved into mild science fiction. So it's not a monster movie, it's a war movie. But you could say it's a monster movie where the monster is a good guy. I mean, you really could say the same thing about Jason, because the older we get, the more we relate to him. Man, those people he kills are just awful. So anyways, yes, The Invisible Agent was the most popular of the film series, and it's more of a spy movie than it is a monster movie. But as it ties into the Invisible Man films, it's considered a monster movie, and Universal Home Video certainly considered it one, as it was released on VHS as part of the, yep, here we go again, the Universal Monsters Classics Collection. And like the Invisible Woman VHS, the Invisible Agent VHS was part of the third wave of this collection and was released in 1993. And this would also be the first and only time this was released on VHS. Now, if you have this VHS and think the fact that this was the only VHS release of this movie makes it rare and worth a lot of money, well, hold your invisible horses, because it doesn't. In fact, it means nothing, because this is very easy to find today and for very cheap prices. Okay, so that's enough of espionage and practical applications of the invisibility serum. How about some good old-fashioned revenge? And we got that with
The Invisible Man's Revenge,
which was released in theaters June 9th, 1944. And this movie is disappointing. Yeah, it's really a letdown. It's not at all what you think it would be. I mean, look at that title. It's a cool title. It's an intriguing title. It's a title that makes you expect more from the movie. It pretty much has nothing to do with any of the Invisible Man movies. It has a very convoluted plot line, and I'm not even going to bother trying to explain it. It makes some attempt to be a horror movie, but comes off as a boring thriller. And it's very confusing, because the actor who portrays the Invisible Man in this movie is John Hall, who portrayed Frank Griffin Jr. in The Invisible Agent. And since he's in The Invisible Man's Revenge, he must certainly portray Frank Griffin Jr., right? No, that would make too much sense. Instead, John Hall portrays Robert Griffin. Okay, so who the hell is Robert Griffin? Another long-lost relative of Dr. Jack Griffin, perhaps? No, not at all. Robert Griffin is in no way related to Dr. Jack Griffin. So let me get this straight. The actor who portrayed the grandson of Dr. Jack Griffin in The Invisible Agent is now portraying somebody entirely different that just happens to have the same last name? That doesn't make any sense. Why wouldn't they just use a different last name? It's unnecessarily confusing. It makes you think way too hard about a poorly written movie that is not worth the effort. And since this has the Invisible Man moniker, this is considered a monster movie. Or at least Universal Home Video considers it a monster movie, because in 1994, it was released as part of the fourth wave of the, oh boy, Universal Monsters Classics Collection. Boy, am I getting tired of saying that. And once again, this would be the first and only time this was released on VHS. And this is one of those movies in the Universal Monsters Classics Collection that is a little bit harder to find nowadays. But when you do find it, people seem to be selling it for an average of $10, except for this guy, damn near $170, huh? I just couldn't imagine who would want this movie so badly that they would pay that. So moving on, with 5 Invisible movies under their belts, it would seem that Universal Pictures was done with The Invisible Man. Aha, it would only seem as such. Well, they weren't quite done yet, because The Invisible Man would meet one of the world's most iconic comedic duos in Abbott and Costello Meet the Invisible Man, which was released in theaters March 19, 1951. And this would be the third film where the comedic duo would meet famous monsters in a film series that would turn out to be a saga. Yeah, you had Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein from 1948, which features Dracula, the Wolfman, and of course Frankenstein's monster. And in 1949, you had Abbott and Costello Meet the Killer Boris Karloff, which features, it features Boris Karloff. And you had Abbott and Costello Meet Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde from 1953. And in 1955, we have Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy. So there you have 5 films that arguably tie in to other monster movies. Now, of course, the most famous of this film series is Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. And like I said, it featured Dracula, the Wolfman, and Frankenstein's monster, but also has a cameo from the Invisible Man at the end. Well, I mean, it's kind of a cameo. You can't really see him, can you? You know? And this disembodied voice was portrayed by Vincent Price. And what's weird is the Invisible Man is one of the characters that Vincent Price is associated with. And it's arguable that it's because of this movie and not The Invisible Man Returns. But I don't know. All I'm saying is, when Abbott and Costello meet the famous movie monsters in these 5 films, I think it's one of the most underrated film sagas of all time. And it's not because nobody talks about these movies or nobody knows about them. Of course they do. It's because they're never associated with other monster movies, and they really should be. Here's what I mean, and it really all comes down to, the Universal Monsters Classics Collection, which of course is a VHS library that contains all of the Universal Monster movies, even the really shitty ones. But you know what's not in this video library? Any of the Abbott and Costello monster movies. Even though they really should be. I mean, Abbott and Costello is a Universal property, and of course the Universal monsters are, so what the hell? Now, I know what you're saying. But Captain Adam, why would they have comedies in a monster movie collection? Which is a good point, and typically I would agree if it wasn't for the Invisible Woman being part of this collection. Yeah, I mean, this movie's obviously a comedy. They describe it as wacky on the back of the fucking VHS case. So why would you let this movie in, but not the Abbott and Costello movies? I'm not sure. It just seems like a missed opportunity and a bit unfair. Now, Abbott and Costello Meet the Invisible Man was released on VHS multiple times, but with nowhere near the pageantry or recognition of the Universal Monsters Classics Collection. Instead, you get these distributions, which have layout designs that look like you bought them at a dollar store. And you know what else? This distribution is a 1992 distribution. 1992? Why does that year sound familiar? Oh yeah! That's one of the pivotal years of the Universal Monsters Classics Collection. And this is a Universal Home Video distribution. The same distribution company responsible for the Universal Monsters Classics Collection. So why didn't they include this? I'm okay now. And then you have this piece of shit distribution. I mean, look at that. It looks terrible. It looks cheap. Okay, in fairness, maybe it's an early distribution. Like maybe it's from 86 or 87. No, this is from 2000. 2000! That late in VHS history, and we're getting shitty layouts like this. You would think they knew what they were doing by now. Okay, so maybe it's some third-party distributor. No, it's Universal Home Video. I don't know, it just seems like people should care a little more about these films than they do. I mean, at least the VHS distributors should care a little more. So yeah, you can find either of these piece of shit distributions for very cheap today and very easily. So moving on into the future, we wouldn't hear from the Invisible Man in the cinematic landscape again until 1992 with Memoirs of an Invisible Man, which was released in theaters February 28th, 1992. And this was a modern take on the Invisible Man, and unfortunately, it was a flop. Yes, it was a commercial and critical failure, which is unfortunate because I didn't think it was all that bad. It had some cool effects in it, like we get to see what happens when the Invisible Man smokes or stands in the rain. And look, Sam Neill. But people hated this movie, and I really don't know why. Is it because of Chevy Chase? I don't know. Now, I agree that this is an odd choice for this role. I think that Chevy Chase was trying to branch out and do more dramatic roles, but it just didn't work very well. It was released on VHS in 1992 by Warner Brothers Home Video. And as you can imagine, this is very easy to find today, but the average price goes for around $10. Which I think is pretty high. I mean, are you really ready to admit to someone that you paid $10 for a used copy of Memoirs of an Invisible Man? But I digress. So from 1933 all the way up till present day, the Invisible Man, in one form or another, has been a massive part of pop culture and the cinematic landscape. He was a part of the comic book League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and was featured in the live-action movie that was released in theaters July 11th, 2003. Now, of course, this character is an Invisible Man, but he's not the Invisible Man, meaning Dr. Jack Griffin, and of course, he's dead, and they reference this in the film. And the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen was released on VHS later on in 2003, and this VHS is rather easy to find today and goes for around $10. And the Invisible Man would be renamed and repackaged in Hollow Man, which was released in theaters August 2nd in the year 2000, and this would feature Kevin Bacon as the role of the Invisible Man, or rather Hollow Man. And this was released on VHS by Columbia TriStar Home Entertainment later on in 2000. And you can find this today for dirt cheap. I mean, look at this guy. $1.99. Wow. And mine was a thrift store find for a whopping 25 cents. And there were even a number of TV shows about the Invisible Man, such as the 1958 BBC Invisible Man television series and a 1975 NBC Invisible Man television series, and this one actually got a VHS release. And this is actually pretty hard to track down nowadays, more than likely because they didn't make a lot of these tapes, basically because the show isn't all that well known. The invisible spectrum within cinema would also have a number of misleading and indirect invisible titles, such as The Invisible Ghost, which was released in theaters April 25th, 1941, and stars Bela Lugosi, and is actually a really good movie, except the title is very misleading. But that didn't stop the home media rights from being up for grabs to any distributor who wanted a piece, as this was released multiple times by multiple third-party distributors, including one from 1986 by Viking Video Classics. And this is the one that I have, and I found it in a thrift store for $0.25, and it was still sealed. Certainly a gem in my collection. And then we have The Invisible Monster, which was a 1950 film serial and does involve invisibility, but certainly not to the extent that the title would have you believe. And this was released on VHS as a 2-tape set in 1991 by Republic Pictures Home Video. And you can find this today rather easily and for an average of around $8. And then we have The Invisible Boy from 1957, and as the title implies, it does involve a boy that can turn invisible. And this film also features Robbie the Robot for some reason. And yes, it is the same Robbie the Robot from Forbidden Planet. And no, they don't rename him and try to repackage him. No, he's Robbie the Robot. And in the movie, somehow he comes back from the future. So, I mean, it's up to you if you want to believe that or not. I mean, it's the 1950s. They had a lot of wacky, kooky movies out, so, you know, you gotta have some forgiveness, I guess. And this was eventually released on VHS in 1993 by MGM Home Video. And you know, this is actually kind of hard to find, and when you do find it, wow, $60, huh? $90! Okay, and then there's
The Invisible Dead!
an Italian horror film from 1971 that gained its real notoriety when it was released on VHS by Wizard Video. And that's only because it's in the famous big box, which VHS collectors drool over. Because really, this movie kind of sucks. I mean, it sucks so bad that it's good, and it's one of those cult classic things, yada yada yada. And perhaps it's the king of the misleading titles, because The Invisible Dead implies that this is a movie that contains invisible zombies, or at least something to that effect. But no, it only has one invisible guy, and he's somebody's servant, and I don't know. Well, he's certainly not dead, so I don't know where this title comes from. And this VHS today fetches a heavy price. $70 or more. And then we have
The Invisible Invaders!
which was released in theaters May 10th, 1959, and is exactly the kind of movie you would think it is. It's about aliens that are invisible and take over human bodies. Because I guess it's easier to just use real people and not alien costumes and effects. I don't blame them. And this wasn't released on VHS until 1996 by MGM Home Video. And this is pretty easy to find today and for pretty cheap prices. And then there's
The Invisible Kid!
which was released in theaters March 30th, 1988, and is certainly a forgotten 80s movie. And Brother Theodore is in this movie, and that's kind of an odd addition to the cast. And this was released on VHS in 1990 by Media Home Entertainment. And if your video library simply must include this little gem, then you'll be thrilled to know that this is very easy to find today and for pretty cheap prices. So, in closing, it would seem that within the cinematic landscape, if there has been a concept for a story, someone has figured out some way to make something about that story include invisibility. It doesn't have to make sense, and sometimes it doesn't even have to include invisibility. As long as you got invisible in that title, everything's gonna be okay. So I wonder if H.G. Wells could have ever known that his story would have had such an impact on our culture. Because it did. And simply just adding invisible to your title makes it more exciting. And I hope that worked for this episode, and I hope you enjoyed today's adventure. So be sure to hit subscribe and give a like, and I'll see you next time, only on Captain Adam's VHS Pirate Ship.